All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Now we are on the Beat Goes On channel, and we got a brief history of Pink Floyd. Like I said, I've reacted to a lot of their songs. Uh, I love hearing backstories and stuff, how the bands got together, the ups, the downs, just, uh, all the ins and outs. It's everything that comes along with the music. So this gonna be a cool video to check out. If you haven't already, make sure you check out the Beat Goes On channel. They got a great variety of videos here. But yeah, we ain't gonna waste no more time. Let's jump right into it.
And now it's time to dork out about the band Pink Floyd.
Here we go.
London, 1963. Roger Waters and Nick Mason meet while studying architecture at what is now known as the University of Westminster. Eventually, they both joined a band called Sigma 6, although at one point the band was called the Megadeths, and they eventually settled on the name the T-Set.
Wow.
Waters played lead guitar and Mason played drums. There was also Keith Noble, Clive Metcalf, and another fellow architecture student named Richard Wright, who played keyboard. For lack of a better word, the T-Set was a standard rock band that specialized in R&B covers. However, soon Noble and Metcalf left the band, and others took their place. There was Bob Close, who played lead guitar after Waters shifted to bass guitar. Close introduced Waters to Chris Dennis, who became their new lead singer. Meanwhile, Sid Barrett, a childhood friend of Waters, also joined up with them playing guitar. In December 1964, they recorded for the first time at a studio that one of Wright's friends let them use. In early 1965, the Royal Air Force assigned Dennis to Bahrain, so Barrett stepped in to become the band's new lead singer. A few months later, they became the resident band at the Countdown Club in London. Each night into the wee hours, they played 3 90-minute sets. This was when their songs got longer with more solos, and they, dare I say, got more experimental with their sound. In the summer, after pressure from his parents and teachers, Close quit the band to focus on his studies, and Barrett also took over lead guitar. After going through various more name changes, by the end of 1965, the four of them, Sid Barrett, Nick Mason, Roger Waters, and Richard Wright, were now billing themselves Pink Floyd. The name came from the combined names of two American blues musicians Barrett loved, Pink Anderson and Floyd Council. Pink Floyd played lots of gigs throughout 1966 and even started to get paid for them. Led by Barrett, their sound was a weird mix of rock, blues, and even music hall. Ultimately, their sound distinctly became known as psychedelic, meaning music influenced by psychedelic drugs, hallucinogenic drugs that created weird states of consciousness. Barrett, in particular, became a regular user of LSD, and that heavily influenced the band's music. The author Lewis Carroll also heavily influenced Barrett's lyrics. Anyway, at one point in 1966, a dude named Andrew King and another dude named Peter Jenner saw Pink Floyd perform at the Marquee Club, and they were blown away. They soon asked the band to become their managers, and the band agreed. With Jenner and King's help, Pink Floyd got better shows, and they got them a booking agent named Brian Morrison, who managed a venue they played a lot at called the UFO Club. Not all of their shows were, well received. Because they were playing more and more of Barrett's experimental songs instead of R&B covers, audiences sometimes didn't know how to respond. After playing one show at a Catholic youth club, for example, the owner refused to pay them, saying the performance wasn't music. King and Jenner sued, but actually lost the lawsuit, believe it or not. But by the end of the year, Pink Floyd had built a solid fan base and soon attracted the attention of record labels. Morrison Wilson and a local club manager named Joe Boyd got the band a recording session at Sound Techniques in London. Soon after that, EMI signed the band, giving them a £5,000 advance, which is nearly £100,000 in today's money. EMI Columbia released Pink Floyd's first single, Arnold Lane, on March 10th, 1967. The song is about a man who steals women's clothes and underwear from clotheslines to wear them. Despite the subject of the song being taboo, and despite several radio stations banning it, it was a hit in the United Kingdom. The band even filmed a music video for it, and it's amazing, creepy, but amazing. In May, Pink Floyd appeared on the BBC's Look of the Week, and I'm sorry, I first just got to play what the host, Hans Keller, had to say about them on it.
To my mind, there is continuous repetition, and proportionately they are a bit boring. My second point is that they are terribly loud. Why has it all got to be so terribly loud?
I gotta say, the responses to Keller's rude questions were delightful.
Well, I don't guess it has to be, but I mean, that's the way we like it. And we didn't grow up with a string quartet, and I guess that could be one of the reasons why it is loud. I mean, it doesn't sound terribly loud to us.
EMI Columbia released the band's second single, See Emily Play, on June 16th, and it was an even bigger hit. They performed the song on the BBC's Top of the Pops and came back on the show 2 more times in the coming months. Even though they hated to mind their singing and playing, meanwhile, Pink Floyd had been recording their first full-length studio album at EMI Studios in London with producer Norman Smith. During its recording, Barrett had started taking LSD much more frequently, and the rest of the band noticed it made him disconnected. Regardless, recording wrapped up quickly, and EMI Columbia released their debut album called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn on August 5th, 1967. The album was a commercial success, and critics adored it. The biggest hit off of it, at least at the time, was Flaming. Although the album also featured the live favorite, Interstellar Overdrive. Capitol Records would release their first several albums in the United States. The band played many shows to promote it in Europe, but had to cancel their shows scheduled in the United States due to Barrett apparently having a mental breakdown, probably due to overusing drugs. After canceling their appearance at the National Jazz and Blues Festival, King told the press that Barrett was suffering from, quote, nervous exhaustion. King and Barrett's bandmates tried to get him help from doctors, but Barrett didn't respond well to it. Whenever they did play shows with Barrett in the fall of 1967, he sometimes played with the band okay, and sometimes stared off into space, or even played with his back to the crowd, playing one note over and over. Even on American national TV, like the band's appearance on American Bandstand on November 7th, 1967, Barrett seemed barely there. This was embarrassing to the band, and King ended their American tour soon after that. Back in the UK, the band played a few shows with the Jimi Hendrix, but things got no better with Barrett, and the band agreed to add guitarist David Gilmour as a 5th member. Gilmour actually was a longtime friend of Barrett, and the idea was that Gilmour would perform live with the band since Barrett couldn't. By January 1968, it was clear that Barrett was suffering from depression and probably schizophrenia. Once joyful and extroverted, now he just wandered around and didn't talk to anyone much. It was like he was a completely different person. His bandmates couldn't handle it anymore. Originally, Barrett was to stay with the band, to just write songs with them and not perform, but even that was not working out. When Pink Floyd recorded what would become their second album, Barrett did contribute one song that made the cut, Jug Band Blues. The song, I think, is a masterpiece, and seems pretty self-aware that the band was phasing Barrett out, and the band had a really difficult time letting Sid go. But by April, he was no longer in the band. Within 4 years, Sid Barrett had left the music industry, retired from public life, and lived the rest of his life in obscurity, which probably only increased his legendary status, to be honest. Incredibly, Pink Floyd's most successful and creative years had yet to come. They hired a new manager, Steve O'Rourke. EMI Columbia released the aforementioned second studio album, A Saucer Full of Secrets, on June 29th, 1968. It featured the single Let There Be More Light, and it got all the way up to number 9 on the UK album chart. A Saucer Full of Secrets was the first Pink Floyd album to feature Gilmour, and the only one in which all Pink Floyd members appeared on. The sound definitely was still psychedelic, with elements of a new subgenre that the band helped invent called space rock. The day after the album's release, the band played a free concert in Hyde Park. They soon returned to the United States with The Who for their first big tour there the next few months. On December 17th, 1968, Pink Floyd released the single Point Me at the Sky. In early 1969, the band returned to the studio to record their third studio album and first soundtrack album for the film More. EMI Columbia released it on June 13th, 1969. It received mixed reviews, but still got a lot of radio airplay in the UK. Not wasting any time, the band also recorded their fourth studio album that year, Ummagumma, also may be pronounced Ummagumma, released by Harvest Records on November 7th. Ummagumma was unique in that it was a double album, with the first half featuring live recordings from shows at Mother's Club in Birmingham and the College of Commerce in Manchester from the spring of 1969, and the second half featuring a single experimental take from each band member. It was the band's most ambitious album up to that point, and a bit risky, but fans and critics mostly dug it anyway. It spent 21 weeks on the UK album chart. After recording some songs for the Zabriskie Point soundtrack, the band spent much of 1970 recording what would become their fifth studio album, Adam Heart Mother, which Harvest released on October 2nd. This would be the last Pink Floyd album Norman Smith helped out with, and the band worked closely with composer Ron Geeson to help them record, as well as conductor John Aldous, who actually led a choir to perform on the record. Both Waters and Gilmour later said Adam Heart Mother was, not a good album. In fact, Stanley Kubrick wanted to use the album's title track in his film, A Clockwork Orange, but it didn't work out, and later Waters said, quote, "Maybe it's just as well it wasn't used after all." Despite all that, Adam Heart Mother became the band's first #1 album on the UK chart. It also did well on American radio stations.
Yeah, that's what I want to see.
To promote the album, Pink Floyd toured a bunch across both Europe and the United States. By 1971, the band was finally making a profit. Yep, believe it or not, up to that point, they were scraping by. That year, Mason and Wright settled down and became fathers, buying homes in London. Gilmour, who was still single, moved to an old farm in Essex. Waters built a home recording studio out of a converted tool shed at his house in Islington. Perhaps not trusting his old tool shed, the band returned to Abbey Road Studios in London to record some new material. I'd argue that this is when Pink Floyd had fully developed their distinct sound that most people identify and recognize with them today. Waters in particular took more control of their sound, especially with the lyrics. Still, by this point, Gilmour was contributing just as much with the overall songwriting. It was even more experimental than anything they had worked on up to that point. One crazy thing they did to mix things up in the studio involved each band member playing on a separate track with no reference to what the other bandmates were doing. Each member played around an agreed chord structure, but the tempo was completely random.
This is
All
amazing.
of this experimentation led to what became their sixth studio album, Metal, released by Harvest on October 30th, 1971. Critics adored its ambition, and it did well in the UK. But it initially didn't sell well in the United States, probably due to poor marketing there. Still, with Metal, Pink Floyd had taken progressive rock to the next level, especially with the album's epic song Echoes, which clocks in at over 23 minutes. To promote the album, the band toured the UK, United States, and Japan. In early 1972, the band recorded what would become their seventh studio album, Obscured by Clouds, which became the soundtrack for a French film of the same name. Harvest released it on June 2nd, 1972, and it featured the the single Free 4, which sounds happy, but has quite depressing lyrics. Obscured by Clouds would soon be overshadowed by a much greater album, however. This one would be a concept album unified by one theme, that theme being the various stages of life. More specifically, the themes of conflict, greed, time, death, and mental illness. Waters made early demo tracks of it at his Toolshed studio, and based on that, the rest of the band wrote and produced new material at Abbey Road Studios from May 1972 until January 1973. The legendary Alan Parsons engineered it using some pretty fancy studio techniques such as tape loops, and the band used synthesizer sounds likely never recorded before. Also, with these recordings, Wright and Gilmour had mastered harmonizing their voices. Harvest and Capitol Records released their 8th studio album, The Dark Side of the Moon, on March 1st, 1973. Then and now, almost everyone agrees that it's a perfect album and is generally considered the band's masterpiece. In fact, many critics consider The Dark Side of the Moon one of the greatest, if not the greatest, albums of all time. It only held the #1 spot on the Billboard 200 chart 1 week, but it stayed on that chart for 736 weeks, on and off, all the way up to 1988. And yes, it eventually became Pink Floyd's most commercially successful album and has sold an estimated 46 million copies worldwide, making it possibly the 3rd most commercially successful album ever created. Woeness. Obviously, this was the album that turned Pink Floyd into superstars and brought them great wealth. While it produced 2 hit singles, Money and Us and Them, the album was meant to be played as an album, and it was, and it still is. The band toured Europe, the United States, Australia, and Japan in 1973 to promote the album, but they really didn't have to. Due to its success, they began to sell out stadiums, and the audience now was dancing and going crazy. To recreate The Dark Side of the Moon live, the band added saxophonist Dick Parry and female backing singers to each show. After touring in France and the UK in 1974, the band returned to Abbey Road Studios to record new stuff. Waters also wanted their next album to have a conceptual theme about alienation, both with relationships and the music industry. Waters wrote a song called Shine On You Crazy Diamond as a tribute to Sid Barrett, who now hadn't been in the band for 7 years. Coincidentally, when the band was completing recording of the song on June 5th, 1975, Barrett randomly showed up to the studio to visit them. At this point, he was overweight with a completely shaved head and shaven eyebrows. Because of this, when he first entered the studio, nobody recognized him. However, once they realized who he was, many began weeping. They played Shine On You Crazy Diamond for him, but apparently he couldn't realize the song was about him. Barrett didn't say much while he was there, and he snuck out without saying goodbye. Except for Waters seeing him at the store a couple years later, this would be the last time the band ever saw Barrett alive. Pink Floyd wrapped up recording the next month, and on September 12, 1975, Harvest released their 9th studio album, Wish You Were Here. By this point, the band had dropped Capitol Records in the United States, and Columbia released it there. While that album got radio airplay with songs like the title track, Have a Cigar, and Welcome to the Machine, critics were a bit more harsh about the album, saying it was a bit pretentious and self-indulgent. That said, today most critics argue Wish You Were Here is one of their best albums, and both Wright and Gilmour used to say it was their favorite Pink Floyd album.
While
it didn't match the success of The Dark Side of the Moon, it still eventually sold over 20 million copies. They continued to tour to promote the album. Meanwhile, the band bought some church halls in Islington and converted them into a big recording studio featuring, wait for it, 24 tracks. That's where they would record what would become their 10th studio album, Animals, which would be released by Harvest and Columbia on January 23rd, 1977. It was another concept album, of course, but this time it focused on the social and political conditions of the UK at the time. During its recording, the band started doing something they hadn't done much before: fighting. There was conflict, mostly due to arguments over, you guessed it, money. the division of royalties specifically. While all members still contributed to creating new songs, Waters took much greater control on Animals. The album was another commercial success, peaking at number 2 on the UK album charts and number 3 on the Billboard 200. As the band toured huge stadiums in Europe and the United States to promote Animals, they grew increasingly frustrated with audience members who were disruptive. Waters in particular had an incident at a show in Montreal in which an angry fan confronted him for not playing an encore, and he spat in the fan's face. This experience later influenced Waters to write new music that would become their next album, The Wall. Waters spent much of 1978 writing this album, and Bob Ezrin came in to help produce, actually writing a 40-page script for it based on Waters' fictional character of Pink, a depressed rock star who reflects on how he got to that point in his life. The Wall.
You know, I just noticed the music playing in the background, and it makes me nervous. Hopefully this video can stay up. Hopefully. I know it's low and he's loud talking over it, but when he said The Wall, I was like, uh-oh, and the song came in. I don't know why they use that music.
Would be a rock opera that examined both abandonment and isolation, symbolized by, well, you know, a wall. Pink Floyd spent almost a year recording it, beginning in December 1978 and not wrapping things up until the following November. However, Wright, who was going through some rough personal issues himself, had stopped showing up to recording sessions. When he did show up, he apparently didn't do much. Due to this, the rest of the band reluctantly agreed that they would have to kick him out of the band, and Wright agreed to quietly leave shortly before the new album's release. That said, most fans didn't even notice, as Wright still stuck around as a salaried session musician who still also played live with Pink Floyd. Harvest and Columbia released The Wall, which was their 11th studio album, on November 30th, 1979. The band admittedly rushed to release it since they were going through some financial troubles. Fortunately for them, it was a huge hit. In fact, it eventually became their second best-selling album of all time, only behind The Dark Side of the Moon. With over 30 million copies sold, it's actually the best-selling double album of all time. The Wall featured 3 singles that all became huge radio hits: Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Run Like Hell, and Comfortably Numb. Critics adored it, and it's also listed today as one of the greatest albums of all time. For the next year and a half, the band supported The Wall with an epic tour where they played the whole album from beginning to end, and they featured big inflatable puppets on stage to represent different characters from the storyline. Later, the band helped the director Alan Parker adapt the album into a film. First released in 1982, Pink Floyd The Wall received mostly positive reviews and has since had a cult following. Meanwhile, tensions had continued to grow within the band, and overall, they had drifted apart. Waters and Gilmour had fought over what material to include for the aforementioned The Wall film. Not only that, Waters now wanted to make new music all by himself without much input from the rest of the band. While the band struggled to move forward, Harvest and Columbia released a greatest hits album called A Collection of Great Dance Songs. Throughout 1982, Waters grew impatient with Gilmour, who promised new material but failed to deliver, doing solo stuff instead. Waters decided he would just write a new Pink Floyd album himself. Gilmour didn't hide the fact that he didn't like many of the new tracks, but Waters moved forward with them anyway. The final result was the band's 12th studio album, The Final Cut, released by Harvest and Columbia on March 21st, 1983. The Final Cut ended up being quite an appropriate title of the album, as it was the last to feature Roger Waters. Featuring the single Not Now John, with its F-bombs and all, the album received mixed reviews and was their worst performing album since Obscured by Clouds. On June 18th, 1983, Capitol released a compilation
So
of
much
mostly
drama.
unreleased songs by the band called Works. In 1984, their longtime manager, Steve O'Rourke, called for the band to meet for dinner to discuss Pink Floyd's future. By this point, both Waters and Gilmour had flourishing solo careers. Well, Gilmour and Mason left the dinner thinking the band still had a future. Waters apparently left the dinner thinking the band was done. Regardless, a few months later, Roger Waters had officially left the band, but Gilmour decided to keep the band going, bringing back Wright on keyboard, and determined to make a new Pink Floyd album, as difficult as it would be without Waters. And yes, there would be legal fights between Waters and Gilmour over the Pink Floyd name, but Gilmour ended up winning those fights. The band brought back Bob Ezrin to help produce, and they recorded at various studios in late 1986 and early 1987. The results ended up being their 13th studio album, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, released by EMI and Columbia on September 7th, 1987. It featured 3 singles that all got regular radio airplay: Learning to Fly, On the Turning Away, and One Slip. A Momentary Lapse of Reason received mixed reviews, and the band went on an 11-week tour to promote it that featured incredible special effects. In August 1988, Pink Floyd recorded live performances at the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island, New York, over a period of 5 different nights, and they turned that into an album called Delicate Sound of Thunder, released by EMI and Columbia on November 22nd. For the next few years, the band pursued their own personal projects. Meanwhile, EMI and Columbia released a 9-CD box set by the band on November 24th, 1992, that coincided with the band's 25th anniversary, at least as a recording and touring band anyway. Finally, in 1993, the band returned to various studios to record new stuff. In reality, it mostly was just Gilmour and Wright. Ezrin once again returned to produce. The new songs ended up making up their 14th studio album, The Division Bell, released by EMI in Columbia on March 28th, 1994. While the album again received mixed reviews and didn't have any major radio hits, it still managed to sell more than 7 million copies. Pink Floyd went on another major tour to promote The Division Bell with bigger special effects than ever before. A live album called Pulse and live film, also called Pulse, later documented several shows on it. On September 19th, 1995, the band released an EP and another film, both called London 66 to 67, featuring previously unreleased songs. At this point, however, the band was pretty much done, whether they knew it at the time or not. On January 17th, 1996, Pink Floyd was inducted into the United States Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Rightfully
However,
so.
only Gilmour, Wright, and Mason showed up to accept it. It's no surprise that Barrett didn't make it, but sadly, not even Waters showed up. For the next 9 years, the bands went on a big hiatus, and then Waters did show up. He reunited with the band as they performed at the Live 8 concerts in Hyde Park. Obviously, the fans there went crazy. Afterward, Pink Floyd was offered £136 million for a final tour, but they turned it down. The Hyde Park show would be the last Pink Floyd concert. Though all 4 did take part in a Sid Barrett tribute concert in 2007. Barrett died of pancreatic cancer the previous year. Wright would die from lung cancer the following year. But amazingly, Pink Floyd wasn't done in the studio. Well, at least not Gilmour and Wright. In 2013, the two decided to revisit the unused Division Bell recordings and fix them up and add to them. The result was the band's 15th album, The Endless River, released by Parlophone Records on November 7th, 2014. It would be their final album, although it's worth noting they released several compilation albums over the past 25 years. Today, Pink Floyd remains one of the most successful and influential rock bands of all time. They've sold more than 250 million records worldwide. They are easily the most prominent progressive rock band band to ever exist, known for their long and complex songs, extreme sonic experimentation, visually stimulating live performances, and deep lyrics. They played a tremendous role popularizing the concept album and just stretching the boundaries of what makes a song, a song. They began modestly as a blues band playing mostly R&B covers, but they ended epically as a band that was responsible for much of the future of all music.
Again, let me just say this. I don't know where you guys are watching, but hopefully everything went smoothly because of the background music being used. Sometimes if the music is low enough, they'll let it through. We'll see what happens. But I love how he said, their music is supposed to be listened to like an album. And earlier in my reacting stages, how people would always request Pink Floyd, but songs they love. You know what I mean? So I never understood like the ending of one song is the beginning of another. But yeah, it's very, very true that you have to listen to it in order for you to really grasp what they're trying to do. But boy, this was a lot of information in here. The ups and the downs and just all the drama. To think about they were doing R&B covers. I want to hear some of that. I want to know what R&B artists they were covering. I just want to know. But to see that they went from that to where they ended at, man, is like crazy. But I feel like almost every band goes through things like that, especially when it's the money involved and you're trying to I remember like what was that movie, Dead Presidents, when they robbed that bank and they was telling we got to stay low key, and that dude went and brought this flashy car and everybody, people were being watched or people were watching them. It's just one of them things like when you have a band, I feel like there's always one in the group that kind of like you end up you having to make that tough decision, like he got to go, because it's all about morale. When you're at a job and you're working with a coworker and the morale is low, stuff like that. But this was a lot of information, man. So much in here that I never knew about. Really, really good informational video. Shout out to The Beat Goes On. Wow. I'm trying to not pause the videos, especially because these ones are long. This was like a 30-minute video, but I just want to sit back and like get the information, then talk about it afterwards. But this was a lot of stuff I had no clue. Like I didn't know. I know there was Fuse, but I didn't know to what extent. And then also with their albums, how they were saying, like critics were saying, like, yo, oh no, actually this album is really good. It's because it's like sometimes if you don't really understand what's going on, the metaphors and stuff like that, you can be lost. It's like when I go watch Jordan Peele's movies and then I go home and I watch like the 20 things you might have missed from Get Out or Us, and you be like, oh, I get it, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. So a lot of times with Pink Floyd, when you let it marinate for a minute, you're like, okay. That's why it's very important to listen to it in order. But again, man, appreciate y'all coming over and watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Peace out.